The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of the Ashford estate in upstate New York, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the tension that filled the drawing room. 24-year-old Eleanor Sinclair sat rigid on the velvet settee, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she processed the words her father had just spoken. A betrothal? To whom? Eleanor's voice trembled slightly, though she fought to maintain her composure. Her father, Richard Sinclair, a prominent railroad magnate, stood by the fireplace, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering flames. Richard cleared his throat, avoiding his daughter's piercing gaze. To Duke Alexander Thornton of the Thornton Industrial Empire. The arrangement was made years ago, Eleanor. Your mother and I believed it was in your best interest. Eleanor felt the room spin slightly. She had heard of the Thorntons. Everyone in New York's elite circles had. They were one of the wealthiest families in America, with holdings that spanned manufacturing, shipping, and real estate. Alexander Thornton himself was known as a reclusive businessman who rarely attended social functions, preferring to manage his vast empire from behind closed doors. "But father, I've never even met him," Eleanor protested, rising from her seat. The silk of her afternoon dress rustled as she moved toward the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked gardens. "How could you promise me to a stranger?" Her father's expression softened with something that looked almost like regret. "The world is changing, Eleanor. The panic of 1893 nearly destroyed us. If it hadn't been for the Thorntons' intervention, we would have lost everything. This estate, our business holdings, our reputation. Alexander's father proposed the arrangement as part of the agreement. It secured our family's future." Eleanor turned to face him, her hazel eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and hurt. "So I was collateral, a bargaining chip in a business transaction." "It's not like that," Richard insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. "Alexander is a respected man. He's 32, accomplished, and from what I understand, he's been managing the Thornton Empire with remarkable skill since his father's passing 3 years ago. This union will benefit both families." Eleanor felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had always been proud of her independence, her education at Vassar College, her involvement in charitable work for the immigrant communities in New York City. The idea of being married off like a piece of property went against everything she believed in. "When?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 months, her father replied. "The wedding is scheduled for January. Alexander will arrive next week to properly court you, though of course the arrangement is binding, regardless." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. 3 months to surrender her autonomy, her dreams of perhaps finding love on her own terms, her aspirations of continuing her work with the settlement houses downtown. 3 months before her life would be forever altered by a decision made without her knowledge or consent. That evening, Eleanor sought solace in the library, surrounded by the leather-bound volumes that had been her companions since childhood. She pulled out a worn copy of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, but the words blurred before her eyes. Her mind kept returning to the mysterious Duke Alexander Thornton. What kind of man would agree to such an arrangement? What could he possibly want from a marriage to someone he had never met? Her younger sister, Charlotte, found her there an hour later. At 19, Charlotte possessed a romantic temperament that often clashed with Eleanor's more practical nature. She sat beside her sister, her blue eyes wide with curiosity. "Father told me about the betrothal," Charlotte said softly. "Oh, Eleanor, isn't it terribly romantic? A secret engagement to a duke." Eleanor managed a weak smile. "There's nothing romantic about being traded like livestock, Charlotte." Charlotte's expression grew more serious. "I know it seems unfair, but perhaps you'll grow to love him. Father says he's quite handsome and very wealthy. Just think of the life you could have. The finest homes, beautiful gowns, travel to Europe. Those things mean nothing if there's no genuine affection," Eleanor replied, closing her book. "I've always hoped to marry for love, or at least respect and friendship. How can I build a life with someone who views me as nothing more than a business acquisition? The following week arrived too quickly. Eleanor spent the days in a state of anxious anticipation, simultaneously dreading and curious about her first meeting with Alexander Thornton. Her mother, Margaret Sinclair, a woman who valued propriety above all else, insisted on preparing Eleanor for the encounter with endless lectures on proper conduct and the duties of a wife. On a crisp November afternoon, a sleek black automobile pulled up the circular drive of the Ashford estate. Eleanor watched from her bedroom window as a tall figure emerged from the vehicle. Even from this distance, she could see that Alexander Thornton commanded attention. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to power, his dark overcoat emphasizing his broad shoulders. Her heart pounded as she made her way downstairs, her sage-green dress carefully chosen to project both elegance and modesty. In the formal parlor, her parents stood beside the fireplace, their faces arranged in expressions of welcoming formality. Alexander Thornton turned as she entered, and Eleanor found herself meeting the gaze of perhaps the most striking man she had ever seen. His features were angular and aristocratic, with high cheekbones and a strong jawline. His hair was dark, almost black, swept back from a broad forehead. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, a deep grey that seemed to assess her with calculated precision. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice a smooth baritone as he bowed slightly. "It's a pleasure to finally make your acquaintance." "Duke Thornton," Eleanor replied, curtsying despite the rebellion that burned in her chest. Up close, she could see the fine tailoring of his suit, the expensive watch chain glinting against his waistcoat, the signet ring bearing his family crest. Everything about him spoke of wealth and privilege, yet there was something in his expression, a guardedness perhaps, that intrigued her despite herself. "Please, call me Alexander," he said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We are, after all, to be married." The casual way he spoke those words, as if their impending marriage were the most natural thing in the world, both irritated and fascinated Eleanor. She studied him carefully, searching for any sign of the man beneath the polished exterior. Her father suggested they take a walk through the gardens, despite the chilly weather, to become better acquainted. Eleanor donned her wool cape, while Alexander helped her with a gallantry that seemed practiced rather than genuine. As they walked the manicured paths, fallen leaves crunching beneath their feet, an uncomfortable silence stretched between them. "I understand this arrangement must be quite a shock to you," Alexander finally said, his hands clasped behind his back as they walked. "I want you to know that I have the utmost respect for you and your family." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "Respect? How can you speak of respect when you agreed to marry someone you've never met, when you participated in an arrangement that treated me as if I had no say in my own future?" Something flickered in his grey eyes, surprise perhaps, at her directness. Most women of their social class would have accepted such circumstances with demure resignation. "I see you speak your mind plainly, Miss Sinclair. That's refreshing." "Don't patronize me, Duke Thornton," Eleanor replied, her cheeks flushing with emotion. "If we are to be bound together, at least do me the courtesy of honesty. Why did you agree to this betrothal? Surely a man of your position and wealth could have his choice of willing brides." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his words were measured. "There are circumstances you don't understand, Miss Sinclair. Sometimes duty must supersede personal desire. This union serves purposes beyond mere romance." His answer only deepened Eleanor's unease. There was something he wasn't telling her, some hidden agenda that lurked beneath his carefully chosen words. As they returned to the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just glimpsed the edge of a much larger mystery, one that would have profound implications for her future. That night, alone in her room, Eleanor stood at her window and gazed at the stars scattered across the November sky. In 3 months, she would become the Duchess Thornton, bound to a man who spoke of duty and purposes she couldn't comprehend. Whatever Alexander Thornton's true motives were, she was determined to uncover them before she walked down the aisle. The game, as it were, had only just begun. The following weeks transformed the Ashford estate into a stage for an elaborate courtship ritual. Alexander Thornton visited 3 times a week, always arriving in his impressive automobile, always impeccably dressed, always maintaining the perfect balance between attentiveness and propriety. To any outside observer, he was the model suitor, thoughtful, generous, and unfailingly courteous. But Eleanor sensed something beneath the surface, like a current running deep underwater. During their chaperoned visits, Alexander would speak eloquently about art, literature, and current affairs. He brought her gifts, rare books, imported chocolates, a stunning cameo brooch. Yet Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was being carefully managed, as if he were following a script designed to win her approval without ever truly revealing himself. One December afternoon, as they sat in the conservatory surrounded by her mother's prized orchids, Eleanor decided to probe deeper. "Tell me about your family, Alexander. Your mother and father. What were they like?" Alexander's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "My father was a businessman, much like yours. He built the Thornton empire from relatively modest beginnings. My mother passed away when I was 12, pneumonia." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly, noting the way his jaw clenched when he spoke of his mother. "And your father, when did he pass?" 3 years ago. A sudden heart attack." Alexander stood abruptly, moving to examine a particularly vibrant purple orchid. "He left me with considerable responsibilities. The company, the family legacy. It all rests on my shoulders now." Eleanor watched him carefully, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers traced the orchid's petals without really seeing them. That must be lonely, bearing such weight alone. He turned to look at her then, and for just a moment she saw something raw in his eyes, a vulnerability that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "That's why this marriage is so important, Eleanor. A man in my position needs a partner, someone who understands the demands of society and can help maintain the family's standing." The words struck Eleanor as oddly businesslike, devoid of any romantic sentiment. "Is that all marriage is to you? A practical arrangement?" Alexander returned to sit beside her, his expression carefully neutral. "I believe in being realistic. Love is a luxury that people of our station can rarely afford. But respect, partnership, mutual benefit, these are solid foundations for a lasting union." Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist that love mattered more than any practical consideration, but something in his tone suggested that pressing the issue would only cause him to retreat further behind his walls. Instead, she changed tactics. "Tell me about your business interests. Father mentions the Thornton empire frequently, but I confess I know little of the specifics." Alexander's demeanor shifted immediately, becoming more animated. "We have holdings in several sectors: manufacturing, primarily textiles and steel, shipping operations on both coasts, real estate investments throughout the Northeast. My father was brilliant at identifying opportunities and acting decisively." "And you? Do you share his vision?" Eleanor asked. "I've had to adapt it," Alexander admitted. "The world is changing rapidly. The Spanish-American War opened new markets. The progressive movement is reshaping labor relations. One must be flexible to survive in such times." As he spoke about business, Eleanor noticed he became more genuine, less guarded. This was clearly his realm of comfort, where he felt in control. But she also noticed he carefully avoided mentioning anything personal. No friends, no hobbies, no glimpses into the man behind the industrialist mask. The next week brought an unexpected development. Charlotte burst into Eleanor's room one evening, her face flushed with excitement and concern. "Eleanor, you must hear what I learned at Mrs. Vanderbilt's tea this afternoon." Eleanor set aside the letter she had been writing and gave her sister her full attention. "What is it?" Charlotte glanced at the door to ensure they were alone before speaking in a hushed tone. "I overheard Mrs. Astor speaking with Mrs. Vanderbilt about Alexander Thornton. Eleanor, there are rumors. Troubling ones." Eleanor's stomach clenched. "What kind of rumors?" "They say his business is in serious trouble. That the Thornton empire is on the verge of collapse. Something about bad investments in South American mining operations and defaulted loans. Mrs. Astor suggested that Alexander's fortune might be largely illusory, maintained only by careful maneuvering and the appearance of success." Eleanor felt as if the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Could this be the hidden motive Alexander had alluded to? Was he marrying her not for any abstract notion of duty, but simply to access the Sinclair wealth and shore up his failing business? "There's more," Charlotte continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Mrs. Vanderbilt mentioned that Alexander had been courting the Weatherby heiress last year, quite seriously apparently, until the engagement was suddenly called off. No one knows exactly why, but there was speculation that her father discovered something unsavory about the Thornton finances." Eleanor's mind raced. If this were true, it cast everything in a new light. The carefully orchestrated courtship, the emphasis on duty and partnership rather than love, the mysterious purposes he had mentioned, it all suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. "Charlotte, you must promise not to speak of this to anyone else," Eleanor said firmly. "If these rumors reached father, it could create complications. I need time to investigate further." Her sister nodded solemnly. "Of course. But Eleanor, what will you do?" "I don't know yet," Eleanor admitted, "but I intend to find out the truth before I walk down that aisle." The opportunity came sooner than expected. The following evening, the Sinclairs hosted a dinner party, and Alexander was naturally among the guests. Eleanor, pleading a headache during the after-dinner entertainment, slipped away from the drawing room. She had noticed Alexander step out to the study to take an urgent telephone call, and her curiosity got the better of her prudence. Moving quietly through the dimly lit corridor, Eleanor positioned herself near the partially open study door. She knew eavesdropping was improper, perhaps even dishonorable, but the need to understand what she was walking into overwhelmed her sense of propriety. Alexander's voice drifted through the opening, tense and sharp in a way she had never heard before. "No, Jameson, I told you to handle the creditors. Keep them at bay until after the wedding. Yes, I'm aware of the timeline. The Sinclair dowry will be substantial enough to cover the immediate debts and provide capital for restructuring." Eleanor's blood ran cold. There it was, the confirmation of her worst suspicions. Alexander continued, his voice growing more agitated. "This marriage isn't about personal preference. It's about survival. The business, the family name, everything my father built, it all depends on securing this alliance. I don't care what I have to do. Eleanor Sinclair will become my wife, and her money will save the Thornton empire." Eleanor backed away from the door, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle any sound. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest. She felt foolish, betrayed, and furious all at once. Every gift, every carefully chosen word, every moment of their courtship had been a calculated performance designed to ensure she would go through with the marriage and bring her substantial dowry into his failing business. She somehow made it back to her room without encountering anyone, her mind whirling with the implications of what she had heard. Her first instinct was to confront him immediately, to expose his deception to her father and call off the wedding. But as her initial shock began to fade, a steelier resolve took its place. If Alexander Thornton thought he could manipulate her so easily, he had severely underestimated Eleanor Sinclair. She would not be a passive victim in this arrangement. Instead, she would play his game, gathering more information, understanding the full extent of his financial troubles and his plans. And then, when the moment was right, she would decide how to respond. On her terms, not his. As Eleanor lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, She realized that the man she was engaged to was not the confident, successful duke he pretended to be. He was desperate, perhaps even dangerous in his desperation. The wedding was now just 7 weeks away, and Eleanor had that much time to decide whether to expose him, escape the arrangement, or find some other way to turn the situation to her advantage. One thing was certain: she would not walk blindly into a trap of her own making. The morning of Eleanor's wedding dawned cold and clear, winter sunlight streaming through the frost-covered windows of the Ashford estate. In her bedroom, surrounded by her mother, sister, and a flurry of attendants, Eleanor stood before a full-length mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The wedding gown was exquisite, layers of ivory silk and French lace, with a train that extended 6 feet behind her. Seed pearls adorned the bodice and sleeves, catching the light with every small movement. Her veil, secured by a diamond tiara that had belonged to her grandmother, fell in delicate waves around her shoulders. She looked every inch the radiant bride, even as her heart felt like lead in her chest. "You look absolutely beautiful, darling," her mother said, tears glistening in her eyes as she adjusted the veil one final time. Margaret Sinclair seemed oblivious to the turmoil beneath her daughter's composed exterior. Charlotte, serving as maid of honor, squeezed Eleanor's hand. Her sister's eyes held understanding and sympathy. She alone knew the truth Eleanor had discovered, though not the full extent of Eleanor's plans for this day. In the 7 weeks since overhearing Alexander's telephone conversation, Eleanor had been busy. She had quietly hired a private investigator, a discreet man recommended by a friend from her settlement housework. The information he had uncovered painted an even bleaker picture than she had imagined. The Thornton Empire was indeed on the verge of collapse. Alexander had made a series of catastrophic investments in South American silver mines that had turned out to be nearly worthless. He had borrowed heavily against the family holdings to cover the losses, and now creditors were circling like vultures. The Sinclair dowry, a substantial sum of $500,000 plus property holdings, was meant to serve as an immediate infusion of capital to stave off bankruptcy. But Eleanor had discovered something else, something that had transformed her fear and anger into cold determination. Among the business papers her investigator had obtained was evidence that Alexander had deliberately misled potential investors about the viability of those South American mines, essentially conducting fraud on a massive scale. Several families had lost their fortunes based on his false assurances. Armed with this knowledge, Eleanor had made her decision. She would go through with the ceremony, but not to save Alexander or to meekly accept her fate. She had a plan, one that would unfold at precisely the right moment. The church was magnificent. St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan, decorated with thousands of white roses and gardenias, filled with New York's elite society. The guests represented the cream of American aristocracy, Astors, Vanderbilts, Morgans, and Rockefellers among them. The ceremony was to be the social event of the season, a union that would cement both families' positions in the highest echelons of society. As Eleanor stood in the vestibule, her arm linked through her father's, she could see Alexander waiting at the altar. He looked distinguished in his formal mourning coat, his expression unreadable at this distance. Next to him stood his best man, his cousin Marcus Thornton, one of the few family members Alexander remained close to. The organ began to play, and Eleanor took her first steps down the aisle. With each stride, she felt more resolute. She had choreographed this moment carefully, timing it to inflict maximum impact. The investigator she had hired sat in the back row, unnoticed among the hundreds of guests, ready to act on her signal. As she reached the altar and her father placed her hand in Alexander's, Eleanor looked directly into those grey eyes. She saw surprise flicker there. Perhaps he sensed something different about her today, a steeliness he hadn't encountered before. The priest began the ceremony, his voice echoing through the cathedral. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Eleanor listened as the familiar words washed over her, waiting for the crucial moment. It came sooner than she expected. If any person can show just cause why they may not be joined together, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace. The cathedral fell silent, as it always did during this portion of the ceremony. But Eleanor had no intention of letting this moment pass. "I have cause," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the hushed space. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Alexander's hand tightened on hers, his face going pale. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" he whispered urgently. Eleanor gently but firmly extracted her hand from his grip and turned to face the assembled guests. Her heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "I apologize for the unorthodox nature of this announcement, but I believe all of you deserve to know the truth before witnessing these vows." "Eleanor, please," her father said from the front pew, his face a mixture of confusion and alarm. She ignored him, keeping her attention focused on the crowd. "Duke Alexander Thornton has presented himself as a man of honor and substance, a worthy partner for matrimony. However, I have recently learned information that calls into question both his honor and his honesty." Alexander grabbed her arm, his grip almost painful. "Stop this immediately," he hissed, all pretense of gentlemanly conduct vanishing. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Eleanor pulled away from him and gestured to the investigator in the back row. "Mr. Harrison, would you please come forward and present your findings?" The investigator rose and made his way down the aisle, carrying a leather portfolio. The guests watched in stunned silence, some standing to get a better view of the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. Mr. Harrison reached the altar and opened the portfolio, extracting several documents. His voice was professional and detached as he began to read. "My investigation into Mr. Alexander Thornton's financial affairs has revealed the following. The Thornton industrial empire is currently insolvent, with debts exceeding assets by approximately $800,000. Mr. Thornton has engaged in fraudulent representations regarding investments in the Bolivian silver mining company, inducing at least 12 families to invest substantial sums in what he knew to be worthless mining claims." The cathedral erupted in shocked murmurs. Eleanor saw her father's face turn red, whether from anger or embarrassment she couldn't tell. Her mother looked as if she might faint. "Furthermore," Mr. Harrison continued, raising his voice to be heard over the commotion, "Mr. Thornton's pursuit of this marriage was motivated solely by financial consideration. He required the Sinclair dowry to prevent the complete collapse of his business holdings and to avoid criminal prosecution for his fraudulent activities." Alexander lunged at the investigator, but Marcus caught his arm, holding him back. "Let him finish," Marcus said quietly, though his own face had gone ashen. Mr. Harrison concluded his report and handed the documents to the priest, who examined them with growing dismay. The gathering had descended into chaos, guests standing and talking among themselves, some moving toward the exits, others crowding closer to witness the spectacle.